The last point I wanted to make was the issue of carbon markets. Because if, as usual in these discussions, a key challenge is the financing to help developing countries deal with whatever the crisis is, in this case, the grand crisis of our age, climate change, we need to look at every opportunity, including using markets to generate additional resources for developing countries and for poor people around the world. And these carbon markets will mean potentially billions of dollars of funding that could flow from developed countries to developing countries to support carbon sequestration. So from our perspective, another way of bringing the poor, of ensuring that the poor's voice is heard at this table, is to ensure that in the provisions of the carbon markets that are established, that land use activities are accepted as a viable means, and there are technical problems that have already, in our view, been overcome, that land use is one of those equations, and that is one of the ways forward to do that. And that two safeguards, not only that land use is in place as one of the acceptable projects for sequestration, because this could generate, as I said, literally hundreds of millions of dollars for developing countries and poor communities, but also that there's a safeguard in place that those land use activities do not harm poor communities, because land use projects can actually undermine the empowerment of poor communities around the world. So those are the few observations I wanted to make, and I'll look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for what I think is a very good scene setter. I would like to draw the focus a bit closer even. Coming from a developing country, I find that, you know, in the scramble for help in the crisis that we're facing, some of the bigger developing countries tend to steal the limelight often from the least developed countries. And that is exactly where I think the focus should also be in our debate today, is to try and get the least developed countries, who often also are those with the smallest voice or the most difficult one to hear, and the ones who are suffering most in this whole scenario, to try and get them a fair place back in the spotlight. So I'm looking forward to hear what comes from the other panelists. Let's move on to Robin Gwynn, the UK Climate Security Envoy for vulnerable countries. And I know that that's what you do for a living, is really try and give a voice to these people.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Johan. That is exactly a perfect cue for me, and I shall try to oblige. Talking a bit more about the political conditions, if you like, which are running into the negotiations at Copenhagen at the end of the year. Perhaps I could just comment first on this word vulnerable. It's in my rather long title of my job, being envoy to the vulnerable countries. And I think we've been very struck in the UK by a point made by His Excellency President Nasheed of the Maldives, who says very clearly that the Maldives vulnerability, he says, our vulnerability is your vulnerability. And that's something that we very much agree with in the UK. I'm sure we all do in this room. We're talking about a shared problem here, where all our countries are vulnerable, but some are particularly on the front line at the moment. And I think that's the focus of my work and our session here today, and indeed of this whole forum. As Robert said, I don't think we need to go into the issues of what the problems are. The question is, what do we do about them? I think the starting point for the UK, and this underlies the creation of my job last autumn, is that climate is really, in a sense, the only truly global issue facing the world today. Of course, we all have massive numbers of complicated problems, but in the sense that every single individual on the planet and the generations to come are affected by the climate, you could argue that it's really the #1 problem. We have the opportunity to make a big step forward in terms of managing the human impacts on climate at Copenhagen, but I think our concern as the UK at the moment is that the world isn't really ready to come together in a spirit which will deliver an agreement which is of high enough ambition to address the size of the problem. So the question is, what can we do about it? We've been considering within the UK different ways to try to actually change the terms of the debate. And if that sounds very ambitious, then it's deliberately so. I think we need to be prepared to move outside our comfort zones in our different countries, in our different blocks. We need to be prepared to look at the problem from new angles, and to really come to Copenhagen recognizing that this is a conference and an issue that the world hasn't really had to face before. As I said, there are very many complicated issues facing us, but this is in a different league, perhaps by definition. So part of our answer has been to develop programs which are designed to try to broaden and deepen the debate about climate change. For example, we were just talking on the panel as you were coming in about linking climate to issues like wealth and prosperity, perhaps to security in some cases. And in the case of my job, working very closely with my colleagues in our Department for International Development, looking at the very clear links between climate and sustainable development. We're also keen for all of our partner countries to see climate as beyond an environmental issue. We have the Honourable Environment Minister here and others at the conference, and they are at the core of the work that's happening at Copenhagen. But I think increasingly we're recognizing that climate is an issue that affects all of our economies, our cultures, our societies, everything. We've also, in that sense, been trying to mainstream climate in politics around the world through our own diplomatic network, in all of our engagement, trying to draw a wider group of people, and actually heads of state and so on, foreign ministers, into the climate debate as well. Remember that all of this is designed to deliver a higher ambition outcome at Copenhagen. So just perhaps to bring this to a close, what do we actually mean by that? And the focus of my job is to recognize that around the world there's a large number of countries which are on the global front line for climate, but which are not actively part of the negotiations at present. And the question is, can we bring them into the debate? And if so, with what benefits? What would be the point of that activity? Related to this, I think, is the concept of fairness and equity. Again, it's a thread running through this forum quite rightly. We believe there is a responsibility on, if you like, the industrialized countries, broadly the Annex I countries under Kyoto. There is a historic causation, that's undoubtedly true, that's a fact. And we believe the Annex I countries need to come to Copenhagen with, if you like, credible negotiating offers that make a negotiation possible around that theme. But there are other factors in play now. There are a growing number of countries whose emissions have grown even since the 1990s, since since Kyoto Protocol was drafted. They need to be perhaps part of the forward-looking solution. And this brings me right back to the role of the vulnerable countries and my role. Our view in the UK is that if the countries on the front line act together more collectively, they can actually exert significant pressure for a better outcome at Copenhagen. And we believe that pressure should be exerted on both the groups of countries I've just mentioned. On the one hand, the richer countries who need to understand the cost of inaction and also the extent of suffering presently and in the future already on the front line in more vulnerable countries. But also we believe the vulnerable countries have a role in pressing some of the emerging economies to think through a bit more what their set positions are, perhaps to move outside their own comfort zones in the same way that Annex I countries need to. So overall, we would want to work with vulnerable countries on that agenda. I'll just finish by saying I've noticed that the logo of the GHF is this kind of interlocking three circles. I'm not quite sure how they form that. Unfortunately, Matthew's just left the room. I could have asked him, Matthew McKinnon. But it seems to me, in terms of what I'm saying, that if Copenhagen is going to work at the right level, you could almost argue that you have three groups of countries who need to come together. You've got the existing industrialized, the developing countries, and those on the front line, the vulnerable ones. And we're thinking if those countries work together in a shared spirit, Copenhagen can deliver a much more effective outcome.
Thank you, Robin.